The book of Daniel, according to its own testimony, is the record of the life and prophetic revelations given to Daniel, a captive Jew carried off to Babylon after the first conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. The record of events extends to the third year of Cyrus, 536 BC, and accordingly covers a span of about 70 years. Daniel himself may have well lived on to about 530 BC, and the book of Daniel was probably completed in the last decade of his life. Although Daniel did not speak of himself in the first person until chapter 7, there is little question that the book presents Daniel as its author. This is assumed in the latter portion of the book and mentioned especially in chapter 12 verse 4. The use of the first person with the name Daniel is found repeatedly in the last half of the book. Chapter 7 verse 2, verse 15, verse 28, chapter 8 verse 1, verse 15, verse 27, chapter 9 verse 2, verse 22, chapter 10 verse 2, verse 7 and 11, chapter 12 verse 5. Most expositors, whether liberal or conservative, consider the book a unit, so Daniel's claim to authorship is recognized even by those who reject it. Except for the attack of the pagan Porphyry, 3rd century AD, no question was raised concerning the traditional 6th century BC date, the authorship of Daniel the prophet, or the genuineness of the book, until the rise of higher criticism in the 17th century, more than 2,000 years after the book was written. Important confirmation of the historicity of Daniel himself is found in 3 passages in Ezekiel, written after Daniel had assumed an important post in the king's court at Babylon. Ezekiel 14 verse 14, verse 20, Ezekiel 28 verse 3. Convincing also to conservative scholars is the reference to the prophet Daniel by Christ in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24:15. Higher critics normally question the traditional authorship and dates of books in the Old and New Testaments, therefore disallow the testimony of the book of Daniel itself, dispute the mention of Daniel by Ezekiel, and discount the support by Christ in the New Testament. But conservative scholars have given almost universal recognition to the book of Daniel as an authentic 6th century BC composition of Daniel, the captive of Nebuchadnezzar. The higher critics' arguments will be addressed in a later discussion of the genuineness of Daniel. Place in the Scriptures. The book of Daniel, written last of all the major prophets, appears in this order among the major prophets in the English Bible. In the Hebrew Old Testament, divided into 3 divisions consisting of the law, the prophets, and the writings, which is also called Ketubim, Hebrew, or Hagiographa, Greek, Daniel is included in the 3rd section, the writings. In the Septuagint, Vulgate, and Luther, however, it is placed with the major prophets. Josephus also includes it in the 2nd division of the Jewish canon, the prophets, rather than Hagiographa. There is therefore general recognition of the prophetic character of the book. Although Daniel's ministry was prophetic, it was of different character than the other major prophets, and apparently for this reason, the Jews included Daniel in the writings. As Wilson has pointed out, the reason for this was not that the Jews regarded Daniel as inferior, nor because the prophetic section of the canon had already been closed, but as Wilson states, it is more probable than the book was placed in this part of the Hebrew canon because Daniel is not called a Nabai, prophet, but was rather a Hosea, seer, and Hakim, wise man. None but the works of the Nabaim, prophets, were put in the second part of the Jewish canon, the third being reserved for the heterogeneous works of seers, wise men, and priests, or for those that do not mention the name or work of a prophet, or that are poetical in form. J.B. Payne observes, "For though Christ spoke of Daniel's function as prophetic, Matthew 24:15, his position was that of governmental official and inspired writer, rather than ministering prophet, Acts 2:29 and 30. In any case, the Jews did not regard the 3rd division as less inspired, but only different in character. This is clearly demonstrated by the fact that they included it in such venerable writings as Job, Psalms, and Proverbs, the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, along with others not considered either the law or the prophets. There is no hint anywhere in ancient literature that the Jews regarded Daniel as a pious forgery. Purpose. In the dark hour of Israel's captivity, with the tragic destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, there was need of a new testimony to the mighty and providential power of God, such as afforded by the book of Daniel. It is obviously not the purpose of the book to give a detailed account of Daniel's life, as important details such as his lineage, age, and death are not mentioned, and only scattered incidents in his long life are recounted. Little is said about the history of Israel or the lot of the Jewish captives in Babylon. The book of Daniel, like Esther, reveals God's continuing to work in his people Israel, even in the time of their chastening. Daniel's purpose in writing blended the themes of prophecy and piety. He wrote first to show God's future program for Israel in light of the nation's fall and after subsequent domination by Gentile nations. Second, he wrote to show what the believing remnant's response should be during this intervening period, as these faithful servants waited for the promised establishment of God's messianic kingdom. In this framework, the tremendous revelation concerning the times of the Gentiles and God's program for Israel was unfolded. While it is doubtful that these prophecies were sufficiently known in Daniel's lifetime to be much of an encouragement to the captives themselves, the book undoubtedly gave hope to the Jews who returned to restore the temple and the city, and it was particularly helpful during the Maccabean persecutions. It was clearly the purpose of God to give to Daniel a comprehensive revelation of his program, culminating in the Second Advent. As such, Daniel's prophetic revelation is the key to understanding the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25, as well as the book of Revelation, which is to the New Testament what Daniel is to the Old. Apocalyptical character. The book of Daniel is rightly classified as an apocalyptic writing because of its series of supernatural visions that exemplify the meaning of the Greek word apocalypsis, which indicates an unveiling of truth that would otherwise be concealed. Although apocalyptic works abound outside the Bible, relatively few are found in Scripture. In the New Testament, only the book of Revelation can be classified as apocalyptic, but in the Old Testament, Ezekiel and Zechariah are sometimes classified as apocalyptic in addition to Daniel. Alexander has provided an accurate and comprehensive definition of apocalyptic literature in his study of this literary gem. Quote, "Apocalyptic literature is symbolic, visionary, prophetic literature, composed during oppressive conditions, consisting of visions whose events are recorded exactly as they were seen by the author and explained through a divine interpreter, and whose theological content is primarily eschatological." End quote. Alexander goes on to define the limits of apocalyptic literature. Quote, "On the basis of this definition, a corpus of apocalyptic literature was determined. The biblical and extra-biblical apocalyptic passages are shown to include the apocalypse of the New Testament, Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14, Ezekiel chapter 40 through chapter 48, Daniel's visions in chapters 2, 7, 8, and 10 through 12, Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7 through chapter 6, verse 8, 1 Enoch 90, 2 Esdras, 2 Baruch, and a description of New Jerusalem." End quote. Apocalyptic books outside the Bible are included among the pseudepigrapha, many of which appeared about 250 BC and continue to be produced in the apostolic period and later. Many of these attempted to imitate the style of biblical apocalyptic books. Usually they developed the theme of deploring the contemporary situation while prophesying a glorious future of blessing for the saints and judgment on the evil. The real author's name is normally not given in apocalyptic works outside the Bible. Apocalyptic works rightly included in the Old Testament may be sharply contrasted to the pseudepigrapha because of the more restrained character of the revelation, identification of the author, and their contribution to biblical truth as a whole. Apocalyptic works, classified as pseudepigrapha, include such titles as Ascension of Isaiah, Assumption of Moses, Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees, Greek Apocalypse of Baruch, Letters of Aristeas, 3 and 4 Maccabees, Psalms of Solomon, Secrets of Enoch, Sibylline Oracles, Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch, Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, Apocalypse of Adam, Elijah, and Zephaniah, and Testament of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because higher criticism is often opposed to supernatural revelation in symbolic form, it tends to deprecate apocalyptic books in the Bible and equate them with the sometimes incoherent and extreme symbolism of the pseudepigrapha. But there is really no justification for this. Even a casual reader can detect the difference in quality between scriptural and non-scriptural apocalyptic works. Frequently, the apocalypses of scriptural writings are attended by divine interpretation that provides the key to understanding the revelation intended. The fact that a book is apocalyptic does not necessarily mean that its revelation is obscure or uncertain, and conservative scholarship has recognized the legitimacy of apocalyptic revelation as a genuine means of divine communication. If close attention is given to the contextual interpretive framework, apocalyptic books can yield solid results to the patient exegete. Languages. An unusual feature of the Book of Daniel is the fact that the central portion is written in biblical Aramaic rather than Hebrew. A similar use of Aramaic is found in Ezra chapter 4 verse 8 through chapter 6 verse 17, chapter 7 verse 12 through 26, Jeremiah 10 verse 11, and the two words of the compound name Jegar Sahadutha in Genesis 31:47. The use of Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of Daniel's period, was related to the fact that the material concerned the Gentile world rather than Israel directly. The fact that there are similar portions elsewhere in the Bible should make clear that there is nothing unusual or questionable about the Aramaic section in Daniel. As pointed out by Brownlee, the shifts from Hebrew to Aramaic and back again in Daniel are found in the scrolls of Daniel at Qumran, supporting the legitimacy of this feature of the Masoretic texts commonly used in English translations. The argument that the Aramaic of Daniel was Western and not used in Babylon as popularized by S.R. Driver has now been clearly shown to be erroneous by later archaeological evidence. As Martin observes, relative to Driver's contention, when he, Driver, wrote, the only material available was too late to be relevant. Subsequently, R.D. Wilson, making use of earlier materials that had come to light, was able to show that the distinction between Eastern and Western Aramaic did not exist in pre-Christian times. Archer says concerning the Aramaic problem, quote, "The Jews apparently took no exception to the Aramaic sections in this book of Ezra, most of which consist in copies of correspondence carried on in Aramaic between the local governments of Palestine and the Persian imperial court from approximately 520 to 460 BC. If Ezra can be accepted as an authentic document from the middle of the 5th century, when so many of its chapters were largely composed in Aramaic, it is hard to see why the 6 Aramaic chapters of Daniel must be dated 2 centuries later than that. It should be carefully observed that in the Babylon of the late 6th century, in which Daniel purportedly lived, the predominant language spoken by the heterogeneous population of this metropolis was Aramaic. It is therefore not surprising that an inhabitant of that city should have resorted to Aramaic in composing a portion of his memoirs." End quote. Major divisions in unity. The traditional division of the Book of Daniel into 2 halves, chapters 1 through 6, chapters 7 through 12, has usually been justified on the basis that the first 6 chapters are historical and the last 6 chapters are apocalyptic or predictive. There is much to commend this division, which often also regards chapters 1 as introductory. As indicated in the exposition of chapter 7, an alternative approach, recognizing the Aramaic section as being significant, divides the book into three major divisions. 1. Introduction, Daniel 1. 2. The times of the Gentiles presented in Aramaic, Daniel 2 through 7. 3. Israel in relation to the Gentiles in Hebrew, Daniel 8 through 12. This view is advanced by Walvoord following Oberlin. Although this has not attracted the majority of conservative scholars, it has the advantage of distinguishing God's program for the Gentiles and for Israel, with the break coming at the end of chapter 7. The division also allows the chiastic structure within chapters 2 through 7 to develop the meaning of the section. Chapters 2 and 7 focus on the succession of 4 Gentile empires God will allow to rise up until he finally establishes his messianic kingdom. Chapters 3 and 6 warn the faithful of the persecution they might experience and encourage them to remain true. Chapters 4 and 5 reminded the remnant of a time when the Gentile rulers will acknowledge that the God of Israel is indeed sovereign over the nations. Although Daniel's divisions may be debated, it is significant that the great majority of interpreters have agreed on the unity of the book. Some, beginning with Spinoza in the 17th century, had other views. Montgomery, for instance, offers a minority view, even among critics, that chapters 1 through 6 were written by an unknown writer in the 3rd century BC, and that chapters 7 through 12 were written in the Maccabean period, 168 to 165 BC. It is significant that all who deny the unity of the book also deny its genuineness as a 6th century BC writing. Although the two halves of Daniel differ in character, there is obvious historical continuity that supports the unity of the book. The same Daniel who is introduced in chapter 1 is mentioned 3 times in chapter 12. The evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the unity of the book. Apocryphal additions. In the Greek version of Daniel, several additions are made to the book that are not found in the Hebrew or Aramaic text. Included are the prayer of Azarias, the son of the 3 holy children, Susanna, and Bel and the dragon. The prayer of Azarias and the song of the 3 holy children contain the prayer and praise of Daniel's 3 companions while in the fiery furnace in Daniel 3, with phrases from Psalm 148. Susanna is the story of a woman protected by Daniel who obtains the conviction of 2 judges guilty of attempting her seduction. These judges were executed according to Mosaic law. Bel and the dragon includes 3 stories in which Daniel destroys the image of Bel, kills the dragon, and is fed by Habakkuk the prophet while living in the lion's den for 6 days, an amplified account of Daniel 6. These stories have been rejected from the scriptures as not properly belonging in the book of Daniel. Miller notes that the fragment of Daniel discovered at the Qumran omitted these additions from Daniel 3 that are found in the Greek, Syriac, and Latin versions of the book. Genuineness. The genuineness of Daniel as a 6th century BC writing the prophet, Daniel does not seem to have been questioned until the 3rd century AD. He asserted that it was a 2nd century BC forgery. Porphyry's 15 books against the Christians are known to us only through Jerome. Porphyry's attack immediately aroused a defense of Daniel on the part of the early fathers. Jerome, AD 347 to 420, in his introduction to his commentary on Daniel, summarized the situation at that time in these words. Porphyry wrote his 12th book against the prophecy of Daniel, denying that it was composed by the person to whom it is ascribed in its title, but rather by some individual living in Judea at the time of Antiochus, who was surnamed Epiphanes. He furthermore alleged that Daniel did not foretell the future so much as he related the past, and lastly, that whatever he spoke of till the time of Antiochus contained authentic history, whereas anything he may have conjectured beyond that point was false, inasmuch as he would not have foreknown the future. Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, made a most able reply to these allegations in 3 volumes, that is, the 18th, 19th, and 20th. Apollinarius did likewise in a single large book, named his 26th. Prior to these authors, Methodius made a partial reply. I wish to stress in my preface this fact, that none of the prophets has so clearly spoken concerning Christ as has this prophet Daniel. For not only did he assert that he would come, a prediction common to the other prophets as well, but also he set forth the very time at which he would come. Moreover, he went through the various kings in order, stated the actual number of years involved, and announced beforehand the clearest signs of events to come. And because Porphyry saw that all these things had been fulfilled and could not deny that they had taken place, he overcame this evidence of historical accuracy by taking refuge in this evasion, contending that whatever is foretold concerning Antichrist at the end of the world was actually fulfilled in the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, because of certain similarities to which things took place at his time. But this very attack testifies to Daniel's accuracy, for so striking was the reliability of what the prophet foretold that he could not appear to unbelievers as a predictor of the future, but rather a narrator of things already past. And so wherever occasion arises in the course of explaining this volume, I shall attempt briefly to answer his malicious charge, and to controvert by simple explanation the philosophical skill, or rather the worldly malice by which he strives to subvert the truth, and by specious legerdemain to remove that which is so apparent to our eyes. This statement may be taken as the attitude of the church consistently held until the rise of higher criticism in the 17th century. At that time, the suggestion of Porphyry began to be taken seriously, and arguments were amassed in support of a 2nd century date for Daniel. It should be noted that at the outset, the theory had an anti-Christian origination. No new facts were raised that challenged the previous judgment of the church, and the support of Porphyry by higher critics was a part of their overall approach to the scriptures, which tended almost without exception to deny the traditional authorship of most books of the Bible. They claimed that books frequently had several authors and went through many redactions, and most importantly, included the almost universal denial by the higher critics of the traditional doctrine of biblical inerrancy and verbal plenary inspiration. The attack on Daniel was part of an attack upon the entire scriptures, using the historical critical method. The great volume of these objections, based for the most part on higher critic premises, which in themselves are subject to question, involve so many details that an entire volume is necessary to answer them completely. At best, a summary of the problem and its solution can be considered here. Generally speaking, critical objections to particular texts have been treated in the exposition of Daniel, where they occur in the text. However, a review of major features of the critical attack on the genuineness of Daniel is presented here. Kepler summarized critical objections under 10 headings. 1. About 200 BC, the prophets were added to the law to compose the Jewish Bible. Yet Daniel is not among the prophets being added to the sacred writings about AD 90, when the Jewish Bible was completed. 2. The book of Daniel is not mentioned in any Jewish literature until 140 BC, when the Sibylline oracles refer to it. In Baruch 1, written about 150 BC, there is a prayer similar to that in Daniel 9. The book of Daniel is also alluded to in 1 Maccabees 2:59, written about 125 BC. Daniel is referred to 164 times in the 1 Maccabees, the Sibylline oracles, and Enoch, written about 95 BC. 3. Jesus ben Sirach, about 190 BC, lists the great men of Jewish history, Ecclesiasticus 44, but among these names, that of Daniel is missing. 4. Words borrowed from the Babylonian, Persian, and Greek languages appear in Daniel. 5. Jeremiah is mentioned as a prophet, chapter 9, verse 2, and his writings are referred to. 6. In Jeremiah's time, also the period of Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldeans are spoken of as a nation or people referring to the Babylonians, but in the book of Daniel they are known as astrologers, magicians, diviners of truth. 7. The book of Daniel is written partly in Aramaic, a language popular among the Jews in the 2nd century BC, but not at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. 8. The author has an excellent view of history after the time of Alexander the Great, especially during the Maccabean struggles, but his history shows many inaccuracies during the Babylonian and Persian periods. 9. The theology regarding the resurrection of the dead and ideas about angels show that the author lived at a later time than that of Nebuchadnezzar. The same may be said in regard to his concern for diet, fasting, and ritualistic prayers. 10. The pattern and purpose of the book of Daniel as an apocalypse, which reinterprets history from the time of Nebuchadnezzar until the time of Judas Maccabeus and Antiochus IV, and written 165 BC, fits better into the scheme and purpose of Daniel than if the book were written in the period of Nebuchadnezzar, predicting history for the next 450 years. These critical objections to Daniel may be grouped into 6 categories. 1. Rejection of its canonicity. 2. Rejection of detailed prophecy. 3. Rejection of miracles. 4. Textual problems. 5. Problems of language. 6. Alleged historical inaccuracies. Rejection of its canonicity. As previously explained, Daniel is included in the writings, the 3rd section of the Old Testament, not in the prophetic section. Unger has defined the erroneous critical view of this as follows. Quote, Daniel's prophecy was placed among writings in the 3rd section of the Hebrew canon and not among the prophets in the 2nd division because it was not in existence when the canon of the prophets was closed, allegedly between 300 to 200 BC. However, as noted earlier, Daniel was not included because his work was of a different character than that of the other prophets. Daniel was primarily a government official, and he was not commissioned to preach to the people and deliver an oral message from God as was, for instance, Isaiah or Jeremiah. It is questionable whether his writings were distributed in his lifetime. Further, the writings were not so classified because they were late in date, since they included such works as Job and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but the division was based on the classification of the material in the volumes. Most importantly, the writings were considered just as inspired and just as much the Word of God as the Law and the Prophets. This is brought out by the fact that Daniel is included in the Septuagint along with other inspired works, which indicate that it was regarded as genuinely inspired. The denial that the book was in existence in the 6th century BC disregards the 3 citations referring to Daniel in Ezekiel, as well as all the evidence in the book itself. Ezekiel 14:14, verse 20, Ezekiel 28, verse 3. Yet liberal critics tend to disregard the references to Daniel and Ezekiel. Montgomery states, quote, There is then no reference to our Daniel as a historic person in the Hebrew Old Testament, end quote. Montgomery holds that Ezekiel's reference is to another character, whom he describes as, quote, the name of an evidently traditional saint, end quote. The quote-unquote traditional saint mentioned by Montgomery refers to a quote-unquote Daniel, who apparently lived about 1400 BC. In 1930, several years after Montgomery wrote his commentary, archaeologists digging at ancient Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra, found some clay tablets detailing a legend of a Canaanite by the name of Akwat, who was the father of a man called Daniel. In the tablet, Daniel is portrayed as being a friend of widows and orphans, and as a man who was unusually wise and righteous in his judgments. This is the one who Montgomery asserts is referred to in Ezekiel 14:14 and verse 20 as a worthy ancient character on the same plane as Noah and Job. Daniel, the son of Akwat, however, was a Baal worshiper who prayed to Baal and partook of food in the house of Baal. He is pictured as worshiping his ancestral gods and offering sacrifices to idols. He was also guilty of cursing his enemies and living without a real hope in God. It is hard to imagine that Ezekiel, writing by inspiration, would hold up such a character as an example of a godly man. Such a judgment is hardly in keeping with the facts. If the Ezekiel references are insufficient, Certainly Christ's clear attestation to the genuineness of Daniel should be admitted as valid. Matthew 24, verse 15. Boutflower writes, "Now what is the witness of Christ respecting this book of Daniel? For it is evident from his position as a teacher, he tastes, and at the time at which he lived, that he must know the truth of the matter, whilst from his lofty morality we are sure that he will tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. How does Christ treat this book, of which the critics form so low an estimate, regarding it as a religious romance with a pseudonymous title, and its prophetic portion as a Jewish apocalypse, a vaticinium post eventum, a prediction written with the knowledge that the event has already occurred? The answer is that this is the book which Christ specially delights to honor. To him its title is no pseudonym, but the name of a real person. Daniel the prophet is the sense of one inspired of God to foretell the future, what shall come to pass hereafter. Our Savior, in his own great Advent prophecy, Matthew 24, uttered on the eve of his death, quotes this book of Daniel no less than 3 times. Matthew 24, verse 15 and 21. Daniel 12, verse 1. Matthew 24, verse 30. Daniel 7, verse 13. The discoveries at Qumran have given impetus to the trend to reconsider late dating of such books as the Psalms and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. On this basis of recent discoveries, Brownlee indicates that the Maccabean authorship of the Psalms can no longer be held. He states, if this is true, it would seem that we should abandon the idea of any of the canonical Psalms being of Maccabean date. Myers gives ample evidence that the Maccabean dating of 1st and 2nd Chronicles after 333 BC is no longer tenable since the publication of the Elephantine materials. He concludes that 1st and 2nd Chronicles now must be considered written in the Persian period, 538 to 333 BC. This trend toward recognition of earlier authorship of these portions of the Old Testament points to the inconsistency of maintaining a late date for Daniel. If on the basis of the Qumran scrolls, Psalms and Chronicles can no longer be held to the Maccabean, then Daniel, on the same kind of evidence, also demands recognition as a production of the Persian period and earlier. Harrison has come to this conclusion. While at the time of writing, the Daniel manuscripts from Qumran have yet to be published and evaluated, it appears presumptuous, even in the light of present knowledge, for scholars to abandon the Maccabean dating of certain allegedly late Psalms and yet maintain it with the undiminished fervor in the case of Daniel, when the grounds for such modification are the same. Harrison points out that the Qumran manuscripts of Daniel are all copies, and if the Qumran sect was actually Maccabean in origin itself, it would necessarily imply that the original copy of Daniel must have been at least a half a century earlier, which would place it before the time of the book's alleged Maccabean authorship. The principles adopted by critics in evaluating other manuscripts and assigning them a much earlier period than had been formally accepted, if applied to Daniel, would make impossible the liberal critic position that Daniel is a 2nd century BC work. Strangely, liberal critics have been slow to publish the comment upon the Qumran fragments of Daniel that seem to indicate a pre-Maccabean authorship. The facts now before the investigator tend to destroy the arguments of the liberals for a late date for Daniel. The supposed evidence against the canonicity of Daniel is without support. Besides, it is highly questionable whether the Jews living in the Maccabean period would have accepted Daniel if it had not had a previous history of canonicity. Rejection of detailed prophecy. Porphyry had claimed that prophecy is impossible. This claim is based on a rejection of theism in general, a denial of the doctrine of supernatural revelation implicit in the scriptures, and a disregard of God's omniscience that includes foreknowledge of all future events. Thus, to claim that prophecy is impossible to make a dogmatic assertion based on a non-theistic worldview that the Christian need not accept. A more particular attack, however, is made on the book of Daniel on the ground that it is apocalyptic and therefore unworthy of serious study as prophecy. That there are many spurious apocalyptic works both in the Old Testament period and in the Christian era can be readily granted. The spurious is not a valid argument against the possibility of genuine apocalyptic revelation, any more than a counterfeit dollar bill is proof that there is no genuine bill, or that the existence of false prophets could invalidate the existence of true prophets. If Daniel were the only apocalyptic work in the entire scriptures, the argument could be taken more seriously, but the crowning prophetic work of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, provides adequate evidence that the apocalyptic method could be used by God to reveal prophetic truth. Further, it should be observed in the book of Daniel that apocalyptic visions are not left to human interpretation. Instead, the revelation is given divine interpretation, which delivers it from vague, obscure, and subjective interpretations often necessary in spurious works. Indeed, the problem in Daniel is not that the apocalyptic sections are obscure. Rather, critics object to the clear prophetic truth the book presents. The argument sometimes advanced that apocalyptic writings had not yet begun in the 6th century BC can be answered by apocalyptic elements found in the contemporary work of Ezekiel and Zechariah, and the essential weakness of such an argument from silence. Rather, apocalyptic writings extended over a long period. Conservative scholarship, while admitting the apocalyptic character of the book of Daniel, rejects this as a valid ground for questioning the 6th century authorship and therefore the genuineness of the book. Rejection of miracles. If Daniel is to be considered spurious on the ground that it presents miracles, it would follow that most of the scriptures would also be eliminated as valid inspired writings. The objection to miracles reveals the essentially naturalistic point of view of some of the critics. Daniel's miracles are no more unusual than some of those attributed to Christ in the Gospels, to Elijah in the book of 1 Kings, or to Moses and Aaron in the Pentateuch. Indeed, the deliverance of Daniel's 3 companions in Daniel 3 and of Daniel himself in Daniel 6 is no more unusual than Christ passing through the mob that was threatening to throw him over a cliff, or Peter's deliverance from prison. Luke 4:29 and 30, Acts 12:5-11. In the biblical context, the rejection of a book because of miraculous incidents must be judged invalid. Textual problems. Critics have raised textual problems almost without number in relation to the book of Daniel, but they have also contradicted each other, testifying to the subjective character of these criticisms. Critics have especially concentrated on the Aramaic portions, alleging many redactions and various degrees of tampering with the text, but there is wide divergence in their findings. Wilson, probably the outstanding authority on ancient language of the Middle East in his day, summarized his findings in these words. We claim, however, that the composite Aramaic of Daniel agrees in almost every particular of orthography, etymology, and syntax with the Aramaic of the North Sem inscriptions of the 9th, 8th, and 7th century BC, and of the Egypt papyri of the 5th century BC, and that the vocabulary of Daniel has had an admixture of Hebrew, Babylonian, and Persian words similar to that of the papyri of the 5th century BC, whereas it differs in composition from the Aramaic of the Nabateans, which is devoid of Persian, Hebrew, and Babylonian words, and is full of Arabisms, and also from that of the Palmyrenes, which is full of Greek words, while having but 1 or 2 Persian words, and no Hebrew or Babylonian. Wilson finds the textual problems are no different from those of other books whose genuineness has not been assailed. While problems of text continue in the book of Daniel, as in many other books in the Old Testament, these problems in themselves are not sufficiently supported by factual evidence to justify disbelief in the present text of Daniel. As with many other arguments against Daniel, the presuppositions of the higher critics that lead to these arguments are in themselves suspect, and the widespread disagreement among the critics as to the nature and extent and textual problems tends to support the conclusion that they are invalid. Problems of language. Critics have objected to the presence of various Greek and Persian words in the book of Daniel, as if this proved a late date. As brought out in the exposition of Daniel 3, where a number of these Persian and Greek words are found, in the light of archaeological discoveries, this objection is no longer valid. It has now been proved that 100 years before Daniel, Greek mercenaries served in the Assyrian armies under the command of Esarhaddon, as well as in the Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar, 683 BC. Wilson has said if Daniel had been written in the 2nd century, there would have been far more Greek words than the few that occur. Yamauchi has also shown the critical objections to Greek words in Daniel are without foundation. The use of Persian words is certainly not strange in view of the fact that Daniel lived in the early years of the Persian Empire and served as one of its principal officials. He naturally would use contemporary Persian description of various officials in chapter 3 in an effort to update the understanding of these offices for those living after the Persian conquest of Babylon in 593 BC. It must be concluded that objections to Daniel as a 6th century writing on the basis of Greek and Persian words is without reasonably scholarly support and becomes an untenable position in the light of archaeological evidence. Alleged historical inaccuracies. Daniel's supposed inaccuracies will be treated in the exposition, which will demonstrate that there is no factual manuscript discovery that reasonably can be constructed as questioning the historical accuracy of Daniel's statements. On the other hand, it would be most unusual for a writer in the 2nd century BC to have had the intimate knowledge of Babylonian history presented in the book of Daniel in view of the probability that the texts and other materials now in our possession may not have been available at that time. The difficulty of identifying Belshazzar, chapter 5, the source of much critical objection to the accuracy of Daniel on the ground that his name did not occur in ancient literature, has been remedied by precise information provided in the Nabonidus Chronicle. The historical inaccuracies have been refuted by the finds of archaeology. For example, the corgency of Belshazzar with Nabonidus actually supports an early date for Daniel. The record of Belshazzar's corgency was lost by the time of Herodotus, 450 BC, and was not rediscovered until recently. Josephus illustrates the problem when he mistakenly assumes Nabonidus and Belshazzar, whom he called Nebo and Delis and Belteshazzar, were the same person. He does this because of the available historical records in his day seem to identify Nabonidus as the final ruler of Babylon, while Daniel 5 identifies this final ruler as Belshazzar. Josephus assumed they were two different names for the same individual. In reality, Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son and corgent. That is why in Daniel 5, he could only offer Daniel authority as third ruler in the kingdom, verse 16. Cuneiform inscriptions have been discovered that confirm Daniel's description of the relationship between Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Questions continue to be raised concerning the identity of Darius the Mede, also considered in the exposition, but the critic's argument is entirely from silence. Nothing has been found to contradict the conclusion that Darius is either another term for Cyrus himself or an appointee of Cyrus, who was of the Median race and therefore called the Mede. As there are several plausible solutions to the identity of Darius the Mede, there is no legitimate ground for objecting to Daniel's statements because of lack of support in ancient literature. There are hundreds of historical facts in the Bible that cannot be independently verified through external sources, and the Bible itself must be taken as a legitimate ancient manuscript whose testimony should stand until well-established facts raise questions. Those who claim that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC allege that the prophecies relative to the Medo-Persian and Grecian empires are often inaccurate. In particular, the claim is made that Daniel teaches a separate Median kingdom as preceding the Persian kingdom, which is historically inaccurate. But in the first place, the critics seemingly willfully twist Daniel's words to teach what he does not teach, namely, a separate Median empire. Second, the alleged discrepancy between the prophecy and its fulfillment is in the minds of the critics. Conservative scholars have no difficulty in finding accurate historical fulfillment of genuine prophecies made by Daniel in the 6th century BC. Here the critics are guilty of circular argument based on a false premise, which leads to questionable conclusions. The larger issue of their interpretation of Daniel's prophecy does not in itself invalidate the genuineness of the book, unless it can be demonstrated that the prophecy itself is inaccurate. Up to the present, The critics have not been able to prove this. Taken as a whole, the critics' objections to the book of Daniel are of the same kind as those hurled against Scripture and against the doctrine of supernatural revelation. Often the objections are products of the critics' own theory, in which they criticize Daniel for not corresponding to their idea of 6th century authorship. Prominent in the situation is the argument from silence, in which they assume that Daniel is guilty of error until proved otherwise. The broad historical questions raised in the study of Daniel have been answered by Wilson, who has demonstrated that the critics have not made an adequate case for their theories or conclusions. He shows that the problem is not with facts, as no facts have been discovered that contradict Daniel, but with theories too often supported by circular arguments. The critical arguments have not been confirmed by fact and must be accepted by faith. For the conservative expositor, it is far more preferable to accept the book of Daniel in view of its confirmation by Christ himself. Matthew 24, verse 15. Interpretation. Problems of interpretation in Daniel are considered in the exposition of the text. If the premise be granted that the book is genuine scripture, and that detailed prediction of the future as in Daniel may be admitted as genuine, the problems of interpretation are then reduced to determining what the text actually says. The interpretation of apocalyptic literature, such as the divisions of Daniel, requires special skills and close attention to hermeneutics as it applies to such revelation. Alexander offers 23 rules to be used in the interpretation of Old Testament apocalyptic literature. In general, however, the meaning of the text can be ascertained especially with the help of fulfilled prophecies in history that are now available to the expositor. Historical records have been kind to Daniel in providing such adequate proofs of the fulfillment of his prophecies that critics want to place his predictions after the events. As pointed out in the exposition, the book of Daniel supports the interpretation that Daniel is presenting truth relative to the four great world empires, beginning with Babylon, with the fourth empire definitely prophetic, even from a 2nd century point of view. The interpretation of chapter 2 is confirmed by chapter 7, which has special revelation concerning the fourth empire in its yet future stage, and by the considerable detail added in chapter 8 on the Medo-Persian and Grecian empires. Most, if not all, of chapter 8 was fulfilled in history in the 500 years from the death of Daniel to the formal beginning of the Roman Empire in 27 BC. The compressed prophecy of Daniel 11, verse 36, through chapter 12, verse 13, is properly regarded as a detailed discussion of the time of the end, the period immediately preceding Christ's second advent. Chapter 9, verse 24 through 27, giving the broad view of Israel's history, may be considered fulfilled today with the exception of verse 27, another prophecy of the role of Israel in the years immediately preceding the second advent. Taken as a whole, the interpretation of Daniel provides a broad outline of God's program for the Gentiles from Daniel to the second advent, and the program for Israel from the same period with Daniel 9:24, beginning in Nehemiah's time. The support of these interpretations as opposed to contrary views will be presented in the exposition. Theology. In its broad revelation, the book of Daniel provides the same view of God that appears elsewhere in the Old Testament, namely a God who is sovereign, loving, omnipotent, omniscient, righteous, and merciful. He is the God of Israel, but he is also the God of the Gentiles. Both of these theses are amply sustained in Daniel. Although Daniel does not concern himself primarily with messianic prophecy, the first coming of Christ is anticipated in Daniel 9:26, including his death on the cross and the later destruction of Jerusalem. Details of Christ's second advent are illuminated in chapters 7 and 12. The doctrine of angels is prominent in the book of Daniel, with Gabriel and Michael named and active in the events of the book. In this, Daniel adds to other Old Testament accounts, but the liberal criticism that Daniel borrowed angelic lore from Babylonian and Persian sources is unjustified and not supported by the text. In his doctrine of mankind, Daniel fully bears witness to human depravity, to God's righteous judgment on sinful human beings, and the possibility of mercy and grace, as illustrated in chapter 4 in the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's clear testimony to resurrection in chapter 12 has been attacked by critics as being out of keeping with his times, as being borrowed from pagan or apocryphal sources, and as being unnoticed by the minor prophets who followed him. All of these allegations are without adequate foundation. The doctrine of resurrection is brought out clearly in Job 19, verse 25 and 26, as normally interpreted. The resurrection of Israel is mentioned in Isaiah 26:19. Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones, chapter 37, while referring to the restoration of Israel nationally, requires the individual resurrection of Israel to accomplish its purpose. Also embedded in the Old Testament are references to the Book of Life, or the Book of Remembrance, which is related to resurrection as early as Exodus 32. In addition, the Old Testament doctrine of Messiah carries with it a doctrine of resurrection, and this theme begins, of course, in Genesis 3:15. On the other hand, apocryphal books rarely mention the resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Archer finds mention only in the Book of the 12 Patriarchs. Further, as Archer points out, the doctrine of the Last Judgment, which implies resurrection, is a frequent theme of prophecy as found in Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, as well as in many of the Psalms. Accordingly, the objections of critics that Daniel's doctrine of resurrection was unsuited for the 6th century BC, was borrowed from pagan sources, or was unnoticed by the minor prophets who wrote after Daniel, lack evidential support and are contradicted by the facts of Scripture. There is no good reason God could not reveal these truths to Daniel in the 6th century BC. Of interest is Daniel's faith that he would be resurrected at the end of the days, that is, at the second advent of Christ. Daniel 12:13. Daniel's contribution to eschatology is evident, with his main theme being the course of history and Israel's relation to it, culminating in the second advent of Christ. Daniel makes a tremendous contribution to theology in keeping with the broad testimony of Scripture, but constituting a distinct advance in Old Testament revelation. Conclusion. In many respects, the book of Daniel is the most comprehensive prophetic revelation of the Old Testament, giving the only total view of world history from Babylon to the second advent of Christ, and interrelating Gentile history and prophecy concerning Israel. Daniel provides the key to the overall interpretation of prophecy, is a major element in premillennialism, and is essential to the interpretation of the book of Revelation. Its revelation of the sovereignty and power of God has brought assurance to Jew and Gentile alike that God will fulfill his sovereign purposes in time and eternity.